Well, good evening, everyone. Um, I hope you're doing well. We here in Central Florida are having a nice windy evening as we prepare to get bombarded by yet another hurricane, which should hit us in the morning. And hopefully we will endure it quite well. I think we will. The next several classes are, for me, very critical in sort of bringing to a conclusion the objective we started out with 2.5 years ago of encompassing the fundamental principles and the fundamental historical the background that is important for the understanding of both the concept of what we believe religion is about, and in particular, the Baha'i concept of the long-range goal of religion, which of course is the unification of the planet into one organic and collaborative commonwealth of nations and peoples. The reason they're so important is because what we're looking at, and even though we've dealt with it in a brief sort of way, of the final, of the placing of the final or keystone, if you will, if we're looking at it from the point of view of an arc, the keystone into that arc that completes the administrative order. So, I mean, we've dealt with this subject before, it's not new, but we're going to look at some details that to me are extremely interesting, and I hope you will find that they are as well. You will find them interesting, maybe not the way I present it, but you will hold it just a second. I'm trying to admit some people who are in the waiting room, and I don't know why they did not come in there. Okay, I think I've got it. So we're talking here about the transition from the guardian to the House of Justice. And in one sense, that's an anomaly to state it that way, because the guardianship still exists, and they coexist as the two pillars of the administrative order, the guardianship and the House of Justice, these twin pillars we've talked about. But we're talking here about the historical playing out of what the guardian went through to bring about, to put into practice the four institutions that were described and portrayed and delineated in the Will and Testament of Abdu'l-Baha, and how by degrees he accomplished so many things. And so calling this topic or this subject the genius of Shoghi Effendi, I mean that quite literally, that I do indeed think that we could have had a guardian who would have been faithful and done great work, and not necessarily have had the panoply of skills and genius that Shoghi Effendi had. He was, and it sort of, if you will, it sort of burned him out at both ends, because there was nothing he was not involved with, because there was nothing that was done which anyone knew better how to do than did he. Whether you're talking about architectural form, whether you're talking about ornamental landscaping, whether you're talking about how to institute by degrees the administrative order, whether you're talking about translating the holy text into exquisite English, and on and on. And we're going to look at some of those things. The best place to look, of course, I say of course, you may not know, but because the book was written some time ago, but the most complete description of the guardian in a book is The Priceless Pearl by his widow and cohort and co-worker, Ruhia Khanum, or Ruhia Rabbani. It's a remarkable work, and you get insight not just into, in other words, the guardian is not some stiff, rigorous figure who, has some regal presence and so on. He was very intimate with the friends and very approachable. And any letter you wrote to Shoghi Effendi as an individual or whether as a community, he read personally and he responded to. My brother received such a letter welcoming him into the faith. It is just a remarkable individual. Now, what's important? Well, let me not say what's important. Let me show you what's important. So let me share my screen. And get started. The genius of Shoghi Effendi as guardian. We're going to begin by just sort of, I wanted to do a more exquisite job with this, putting these pictures together of the sequence of the guardian with music and so on. And perhaps someday I'll have time to do that. But there's a more strategic reason for why you're going to see these. And I'll see if you can figure them out, because there's a question I have at the end of them. All right, you're ready? Here we go. And we've seen that one before. I would say he's about 2 years old there. I would say 3 there. I would say 5 years old there. Shoghi Effendi is the one on the right here with his brother and sister. I would say he's about 10 years old there. This is his mother, the daughter of one of the 4 daughters of Abdul-Baha. He's a young college student. Beautiful, dignified figure. This is one of 2 pictures I have seen where he's smiling. And these are obviously before he was appointed guardian. I don't have a picture of him smiling after that, though I'm sure he must have. You see, he's got on hiking boots and socks. He loved to hike. He loved to walk. One of the reasons he went to the mountains after he was appointed guardian, of course, we'll discuss that tonight, was because this is one thing where he could clear his mind, and was hiking through the mountains in Switzerland. This is the second one where he's, I don't know, he's smiling, but he seems happy here. This is I think the most contented look on his face that I've seen. He's with Esselmont in England. Now you see the seriousness of someone who is a dedicated servant, not yet guardian, but you see he's working on the little portable typewriter there. Probably this is when he was secretary to Abdul-Baha. There he is with the Most Holy Leaf, Bahia Khanum, his aunt, his great aunt, the sister of Abdul-Baha. Oh, and this, of course, a very famous picture, very beautiful picture, because you get the sense of power emanating from both faces. We could sit here and describe our impressions of what this picture signifies and means for the rest of the evening, and not exhaust the power of this picture. Abdul-Baha seeming to look into the future, Shoghi Effendi looking in the present, having no idea. Remember, he has no idea that he is going to have some position of authority in the faith. And of course, Abdul-Baha already knows that. Whoops. Now, this is one of the last pictures before he passed. There's kind of a smile there, but mostly just candor and love. And so the question is this: what happens between this and this? Well, of course, we've already discussed it. He becomes guardian. And you say, and you can see of 36 years of being guardian from 1921, when Abdu'l-Baha died, until his own death in 1957, 36 years of unrelenting, unstinting work. So on the one hand, he died extremely young in normal terms, 60 years old. And we're going to discuss that next time, about his passing and why it's important, not only that he passed, how he passed, and what circumstances under which he passed. Extremely important to know that. For example, why was he in England? And why is he buried in England? Why not in the Holy Land? All that has to do with this incredible man. So let's just get a glimpse. And of course, it's going to be just a glimpse. You have to read the totality of the Priceless Pearl together with several other tributes to him. And the really, frankly, the comprehensive assessment of his talents and contributions is yet to be written. It would have to be voluminous indeed. But we're going to look at his genius in terms of the various arenas in which he participated. So the question is, where are the pictures in between? And I'm sure some of you could answer this right now, and we'll discuss it more in the Q&A. But the answer very simply is, when he became guardian, he wanted no, and I'm speaking on his behalf here, not with his permission, or not authoritatively, but this is my own understanding. You can come up with your own answer to this question. But he did not want his picture taken. He did not want to be the face of the community. That was Abdu'l-Baha's job, and he wanted, explicitly stated, he wanted no comparison between the authority he had and the authority of Abdu'l-Baha. And we're going to read a passage tonight where he states that very explicitly to Leroy Aois. So there are no pictures in between, because he did not let pictures be taken. Now, the best, and I've said this before, and we've talked about this before, but so far as I know, by far the most succinct assessment of the character and panoply of skills of the guardian is stated in a talk which is available online. Just look it up, just Google it, and then you'll find both the printed version and the narrated version. It's a little rough, the narration, because it was done on a wire recorder in 1957 in Johannesburg, South Africa, but just a month after the passing of the guardian in November of 1957. In the days of the guardian, and Leroy Aois, and you can see in his face that he was quite a man, and he was a secretary to Shoghi Effendi, and he was a brilliant and wonderful man. He met Abdu'l-Baha when he was when Abdu'l-Baha came to America, he and his sister. So most of what I'm going to read to you are quotes from the talk, and they're just little snippets from the talk of Leroy Aois. Another one of the qualities that you found in Shoghi Effendi, and which rather astonished me, was humility. I had studied a lot in the writings about humility. I had read a lot in the religious teachings about being humble, and I thought I knew a little bit about what it meant. But you knew nothing about humility until you saw Shoghi Effendi. Shoghi Effendi never spoke of himself. And one of the things that interested me very much when he was talking about the cause and its development, he would speak about the conditions in the days of the Bab, and he would speak about the conditions and activities of the faith in the days of Baha'u'llah, and he would speak about the conditions and activities of the faith in the days of Abdul Baha. And then he would speak about the faith in the days after Abdul Baha. He never said in the days after of the Guardian or in my period of administration, but he always referred to the days after Abdul Baha. One time we were talking and I made some comment to the Guardian about some of the activities of the cause. I don't remember what it was, and I mentioned his name in the same sentence and almost in the same vein as that of the master. And he stopped me and he said, don't ever do that. Don't ever mention my name in the same breath as you mention the master. The master was like the ocean, I'm like a drop. The master was like the sun and I'm like an atom. So don't ever, ever mention my name in the same theme or the same trend of thought as that of the master. There's a vast gulf between Abdul Baha and all the rest of creation and between the Guardian. And of course, that was said in private. So this was not something to, that he was, sometimes we can, talk about our humility as if, well, I'm trying to be humble. And of course, when you say that, you're in effect, bragging about yourself. So this was not a public statement. Now, one of the tests, as we mentioned before, that immediately confronted Shoghi Effendi was the maintaining of the covenant, because no one, including he, expected that there would be the position of the guardianship, and then it certainly, if there were such a position, would go to a 24-year-old young man who was largely not, I wouldn't say in the background, but who was one among many of the descendants of Baha'u'llah. And almost immediately, the family began to rebel against this idea. How can my cousin, how can my cousin claim to be head of the faith? Or how can my brother claim to be head of the faith? Etc. You can appreciate it. We've talked about it before. Shoghi Effendi had kept the disunity within his family private. Now, if you remember, this is very similar to the technique or the tactic that Baha'u'llah utilized with Mirza Yahya. As long as he could, as much as he could, he kept the disunity and machinations of Mirza Yahya private. He did not want to disclose any disunity in the faith. And of course, he was constantly trying to bring Mirza Yahya back. And there's another reason for that, of course, and that is you don't want any sense that someone is causing this disunity other than those who disunify themselves. So in other words, you don't, as I've heard it said very well, insofar as covenant breaking is concerned, you don't break the law. It's similar to this one. You don't break the law of God. You break yourself on the law of God. Well, the same thing's true with the covenant. You don't break the covenant. The covenant's doing very well, but you break yourself by opposing the covenant. Shoghi Effendi had kept the disunity within his family private, including when his cousin Rui Afnan made an unsanctioned tour of the United States Baha'i community. However, matters came to a head through the 1940s, and from 1941 to 1945, he declared his siblings, cousins, and aunts as covenant breakers, formally expelling them from the community for various reasons. And there are a lot of reasons, and there are a lot of stories behind this, and many of them are discussed by Muriya Khanum. He sent, and of course, this wasn't something he did easily. Remember, this is years, these decades of enduring their violation of his explicit commands and doing things that were explicitly harmful to the faith. He sent Rahia Khanum to attempt to reconcile Rui Afnan with the community at some point, but he, Rui Afnan, rejected the invitation. In the case of his brother Hossein, Shoghi Effendi spent 8 months attempting to mediate the situation before expelling him, but his efforts were unsuccessful, with his family remaining expelled from the faith. Now, of course, this becomes very critical later on when Shoghi Effendi passes and there's no other lineal descendant of Baha'u'llah who is still faithful to the cause, who could be considered. And of course, there are other reasons that there could be not be a second guardian, but that's among them. So this was, as I said last time, imagine the burden that fell upon his shoulders, a 24-year-old young man doing graduate work, preparing as best he could to help Abdu'l-Baha in some way, to be his secretary, to do translation work and so on. So he was at Oxford and studying rigorously in English. And we'll have a nice anecdote about that later. This continues the talk by Leroy Owis. I want to say a few words now about the guardianship. I told you about the life of the guardian, his guidance, his foreknowledge, and that's something in another anecdote he talks about, that he knew, he realized, and from several instances that he goes into, that Shoghi Effendi knew what was happening in your mind, in your presence. And so he jokingly says, and so you had to be very careful what you were thinking about when you were in his presence. Shoghi Effendi was a very remarkable young man, and of course he just worshipped Abdu'l-Baha. And when Abdu'l-Baha passed away, the whole world became dark for him. All light had gone out. And when he returned to the Holy Land, this is after the year he spent, or I forget how long exactly it was, I think he made more than one trip, to Switzerland. He had in mind from the things which Abdu'l-Baha had said to him, and I'm telling you what he said to me, that I had in mind, and we read this last time, that, now, excuse me, this is not when he's returning from Switzerland. This is when he's returning from England after he finds out that Abdu'l-Baha has deceased. That Abdu'l-Baha would give me the honor of calling the great conclave, calling together the great, the conclave that would elect the House of Justice. And I had thought in his will and testament that probably was what he was instructing to be done. But he said, instead of that, instead of that, I found that I had been appointed the guardian of the cause of God. And he said, I didn't want to be the guardian of the cause. In the first place, I didn't think I was worthy. I didn't want to face these responsibilities. I didn't want to be the guardian. I knew what it meant. I knew that my whole life as a human being was over. I didn't want it, and I didn't want to face it. So as you remember, I left. Remember, I left the Holy Land and I went up to the mountains of Switzerland, and I fought with myself until I conquered myself. Then I came back and turned myself over to God, and I was the guardian. Now, he said, every Baha'i in the world, every person in the world has to do exactly the same thing. Whether you're a hand of the cause, or whether you're a knight of Baha'u'llah, or whether you're a member of the National Assembly, whether you're a teacher, whether you're a pioneer, whether you're an administrator, or whatever you are in the cause, every Baha'i must fight with himself and conquer himself. And when he's conquered himself, then he becomes a true instrument for service to the cause of God. And not until that, he won't achieve his great success until he has done it. And this is what every Baha'i in the world should know. This to me is just amazing. But particularly this idea that he realizes that his life as an individual aspiring to do, gee, I wonder what I'd like to become when I grow up, what I'd like to do with my life, and so on, that it's gone, that the weight of the faith is on his shoulders, and in believing as he does, that the faith is the source of the reformation of the world. In effect, the fate of humankind to a large extent rests on the wisdom of the decisions which he will come forth with. Now, we go into another part of this talk by Hand of the Cause IOS that is incredibly powerful. He goes through a day in the life of the guardian. And he says, you know, this not the same day would occur every day. There would be some variance, but this is sort of the paradigm of what most days would go like. And if you take it in, you're just astounded that he lived to be 60. I want to give you just one day in the guardian's life so you can appreciate a little bit more of what it is to be head of a faith like the Baha'i Faith. Shoghi Effendi usually rose in the morning about 5:30, and then he had his period of prayer and devotions and meditation. After that, he would receive, or he still had a pile of mail from yesterday, or the day before piles, or the day before, piles of mail. And he would start to go through this mail from all over the world, and he would indicate on each letter what should be done with it. Well, the thing that interested me very much, because I come from a business background and had a large office and had lots of mail, I never opened my own mail. It was always handled by someone else. But Shoghi Effendi opened every letter that was addressed to him. Anyone that wrote a letter that was addressed to Shoghi Effendi, that was opened by the guardian himself. And he took out the letter and he read it, and then he indicated and instructed what was to be done with it. Sometimes he gave it to Ria Khanum to respond to. Sometimes he gave it to me. Other times he gave it to Dr. Hakim if it were to the Oriental countries and had to be answered in Persian. Every piece of mail that was ever addressed to the guardian of the cause was received by him personally and was opened by him personally, so that everyone was assured that their message to him throughout his own eyes, his own heart, and his own mind. Well, after going through this correspondence for hours, and don't think it was light, one evening he came over and said, "Today I received 700 pages of minutes and records from different parts of the world, and I had to read them all." Now that came pretty nearly every day. Not in that volume, but I just mentioned that volume just so that you have an idea of what it was just to read the mail, let alone consider what was to be done about all of the questions that were asked, and to issue the instructions about what should be done all over the world. And in the afternoon, when he went up to Mount Carmel and the Baha'i gardens there, which he had built himself, and he had met the Oriental pilgrims, he walked with them in the gardens, he talked with them, he had tea with them, he answered their questions, he talked about the cause in all parts of the world, but particularly in the Orient, what should be done, this problem, that problem, the other problem. And then he would lead them to the shrine of the Baha. And after a period of prayer and devotion there, in which he chanted for them, they would return and he would come down and continue with his mail and his cables as they came in during the day, answer the cables. Then in the evening, he would come in and have dinner with the pilgrims from the western part of the world and with the members of the International Baha'i Council, and we'll get to what that is later. First it was appointed, and then it was elected as the precursor to the House of Justice. But he appointed the first one, I think about 1951. Then he would talk about the cause with the people from the West. He talked with them in English, since Shoghi Effendi spoke a number of languages, English and Persian and Arabic very well. And he would talk about the cause and the different conditions throughout the world. Then he would talk about the conditions in their own country. He goes on with this, and I had to cut out so much, but he gave an example of how he knew more about what was going on in the faith in the countries of the pilgrims than they knew themselves. And he gives an example of that. And again, not in a condescending way, but just the acute knowledge he had of every single thing that was happening in every part of the world. The infallibility of the guardian. Now, of course, the guardian is infallible according to the doctrine of the, not doctrine, but well, the doctrine is stated in the Will and Testament of Abdu'l-Baha. So there's a distinction in the Baha'i writings between what is called inherent infallibility, which only obtains to the manifestations, and conferred infallibility, which is no less infallible. I mean, something is either infallible or it's not, or a person is. But it means that this adornment, this capacity, this ability is conferred upon him through the Holy Spirit by Abdu'l-Baha. And Ios was acutely aware of it operating. And then he would take that occasion to talk over the many problems with the International Council. Shoghi Effendi was not a person who had very many secrets. He allowed no one to speak of anything of the things that happened in the Holy Land, or actually any of the personal discussions that took place at the table with the pilgrims. But in the business of the cause around the Holy Land, he usually talked about it. He talked at that time and gave his instructions. And it is very interesting. His instructions were always right. One time I was handling a certain matter for the Guardian with the government authorities. Mr. Oper was there, and he will remember it. I was telling the Guardian, and he asked me what I was doing, and I told him. And he said, well, I think you'd better go to see Mr. Eitan, and he's our friend, and he'll help us. This is with the Israeli government, because this would be after 48 when Israel, the state of Israel, was formed by the United Nations. Now, that didn't seem to me to be the wise thing for me to do, because I'd been handling it along a different line. And I explained to the Guardian, now I think Mr. So-and-so is our friend. Do you see him? Well, actually, Mr. Eitan is the one that solved the whole problem for us later on. I went to him and appealed to him very strongly, and that settled it. I mentioned this to show the guidance of the Guardian and to show how in all things he was making decisions all the time. You send him a cable from South Africa, he considers it and he prays about it and he gives you an answer, and that's the will of God, and that's the way it works. Isn't that beautifully said? There are other samples he gives in this talk of indications of what the Guardian knew. I wish we had time to go over it, but again, you can read it for yourself. I advise you to do so, but listen to it, because you get the spirit of Hand of the Cause Ios as well as that of the Guardian filtered through his lovely persona. So when I give you this as a picture of one day in Shoghi Effendi's life, remember, it wasn't one day and then he rested for a week. It wasn't 2 days and then he rested. It was 3 days. It was 4 days. It was 5 days. It was 6 days. It was 7 days. And it was that way week after week after week. When he was in the Holy Land, there was no rest whatsoever for the Guardian. From early morning, 5:30 in the morning, until 11 or 11:30 at night. Burdened problems all over the world. People never thought to, until the last few years, to send him the encouraging word of what had been done, the great victories that had been won. But if anyone had any trouble, he would cable the Guardian for guidance, and he had to solve the problems of the world in that way. So he was continuously under the pressure of the friends at all times. So his genius as an administrator, this is something else Ios talks about. This is not from Ios. This is a map that surely some of you have seen. It's available online, and it was hand-drawn by the Guardian. And it is one of the many maps he used to make to try to figure out who would go where for pioneering to spread the faith throughout the world. So he did it strategically from where we had resources in one place. And you see, of course, the place of the greatest emanation. It looks almost like the symbol on the Japanese flag of this rising sun that you see emanating from the United States. This is the bulk of pioneers. And this is, of course, during the 10-year World Crusade, where the sole purpose of that crusade, or the primary function or focus of it, was to establish national spiritual assemblies throughout the world, so that these pillars in electing the Universal House of Justice would be plentiful in number and substantial in their in the quality of the believers who constituted those institutions. Because remember, there weren't any when he attained office, when he was appointed in 1920. There were no national spiritual assemblies because the institution hadn't been invented yet. So he not only had to create what it would be like, how it would be elected. This is what Baha'i Administration book, one of his first collection of letters, is about. How do you run an LSA? How do you create administration? Once he said, Leroy, you talk, and this is so beautiful, the genius of the plans. And obviously Leroy had commented on how ingenious the Guardian had been in building the faith basically from nothing. And so this is quite humorous. Once he said, Leroy, you talk like you think that I sat over here in the Holy Land and I had a blueprint of this Baha'i world order and that I started to build it. As soon as I found the friends strong enough to do this, I said, build this wall. And then a little later, I said, build that wall, and then build this wall, and then lay that floor. If you have that idea, dismiss it from your mind. When I became guardian, I didn't know what the steps to be taken were. And that's so beautiful, such a frank admission. God guided me. And when he gave me guidance, I did what he guided me to do. And then I didn't know what the next step would be until I got the guidance. And when I got the guidance, we did it. And then I didn't know what the next step would be. I may have thought of what it might be, but I didn't know until I got the guidance. And then I did. And this is so beautiful because it gives you a personal insight of what it's like for this individual to have infallible guidance from the world of the spirit, from the spiritual world. I don't know. And then but it's sort of like, I don't know what's next, but I know I will know when I know. And this is what he says next. He said, I have supreme confidence that God will guide me to do whatever is necessary for the cause, whenever it should be done. And he says the Baha'is of the world must have exactly that same confidence. They must have confidence that God will guide the guardian to do what should be done for the welfare of the cause at the moment it should be done. And unless they have that confidence, the cause cannot succeed. And of course, we can just retranslate or restate that same thing about the House of Justice now and the study of the 9-year plan. This is guidance from God. I once just not jokingly, but in sort of a mild sort of way, said that receiving a letter from the House of Justice was tantamount to receiving a letter from God and guidance from God, because that's what it is, because they have conferred infallibility in their decisions the same way he did. Well, we'll talk about that next time. Leroy, as you know, I've been guardian of the cause for 36 years. And this, of course, was conversations the last year of his life. And the responsibilities and worries are just weighing me down. In the days of the Bab, the faith was established in 2 countries. In the days of Baha'u'llah, there were 11 countries. In the days of Abdul Baha, there were 31 countries. This doesn't mean they had national assemblies, understand. He's just talking about countries where Baha'is resided. Today, there are over 250 countries and islands in the world. He said, I have so many things weighing me down. I have to consider the future of the cause. I have to consider the welfare of the cause in every country. And I have all this burning correspondence, all of this work, all of the time, all of these things weighing me down, and I have got to get relief, and I have got to have relief. Then I said, Shoghi Effendi, why don't you give me those papers? I can do a lot more work than what I'm doing. I'll have to have a lot of help in my office, and I've got to have more help doing the things that I'm doing. But I can take those papers and I can quote those papers and I can digest them. I can tell you what the questions are and I can let you know what they are. And all you have to do is let me know what the answer is. I said, that will give you some relief. And he turned with tears in his eyes and he said, only God can give me relief. Now, this is a part of the talk where I always, it says, did the guardian have some sense that he was about to die? And he says, in some instances, you think maybe he did, and in others, you don't. And this was one of those where he felt like he had not only a sense that he was soon to pass, but that it was something he looked forward to. His genius in providing ceaseless guidance. And here I'm talking about all the letters he wrote. There's just incredible, voluminous collections of letters, some of which are still coming in from all parts of the world. They contained encouragement and love and appreciation, frank and authoritative advice, information about the progress of the faith in every arena, so that while you may think that, oh my gosh, the faith isn't working, you know, we haven't had a new people come into this community in so long, we haven't been meeting because of the pandemic and so on. And then you get a letter from the House of Justice, or you go on Baha'i News Network and you see what's happening in other lands and building the shrine of Abu Baha and building Mashrikul cars here and there and so on. The same qualities. Milestones and accomplishments of every sort. And of course, at this time, he was building the shrine, the superstructure on the Shrine of the Bab, which he himself, it was designed by William Sutherland Maxwell, his father-in-law, the father of Ruya Khanum, who was, of course, a great architect from Quebec, who designed the Frontenac Hotel, which is a very famous edifice there. But he would bring, and Ruya Khanum describes this in a great deal, that Maxwell would bring his design and Shoghi Effendi, well, that's okay, but you need to make the dome a little narrower and so on. In other words, he was actually the director of overseeing the architect. Specific adulation of the heroines and heroes in the teaching field. Teaching plans once we were ready to carry them out. And that's something that's very important that we'll be looking at, the teaching plans. So let's just again, like we did with the series of pictures, let's just sort of meditate and look at the dates on these. And remember these, you've read them, I'm sure, how thick they are with just incredible and memorable advice and exhortation. So this is 1928. That's the date the book came out. It's covering all the messages from, as you can see, 1922 to 32, first 10 years of his ministry. The decisive hour, these are telegrams that went throughout the world from 32 to 46. The World Order of Baha'u'llah, this came out first in 29 and then in 36. The Advent of Divine Justice, this came out in 1939. The Promised Day Has Come, 1941. This is a narrative about what happened to the kings and rulers to whom Baha'u'llah wrote. What was the outcome? God Passes By. This was his gift to the Baha'i community on the centenary of the beginnings of the Baha'i Faith. And it is a masterful work of both history and analysis. Citadel of Faith, the last collection of letters from 47 to 57. He died in 57. And of course, one of the lots of important Messages to America, America in Time of Peril. And if you read it now, it's as on point with what's happening in this day politically as it was then. And notice that that's almost 50 years ago. Well, yeah, it is. It's more than 50 years ago. Messages to the Baha'i world. Now, those just collection of letters, and just to America primarily. There are many other collections of his letters to other countries. And I'm going to tell you a quick anecdote, which, as I understand, comes from, was experienced by Adib Tahirzadeh, the member of the House of Justice, who also wrote the 4-volume work, The Revelation of Baha'u'llah, as well as several other very important scholarly works. He went to school at the University of Tehran in electrical engineering before coming to England. And the story goes that he was in a class and was, I forget what they were discussing, but the teacher said, and of course you, Mr. Tahirzadeh, know who the greatest writer in Persian prose is, I presume. And he was taken aback, Tahirzadeh was, and he says, it's your own guardian. The Persian, you know how incredible the works and writings of Shoghi Effendi are. They're not easy. He's not trying to make them easy. He's trying to make them eloquent and incredibly artful and profound, and they are. So the story goes that after he left Iran, Tahirzadeh went to England, where he did postgraduate studies. And he was in a class, and well, you can guess. The teacher was talking and said, and of course, Mr. Tahirzadeh, I guess you know who the greatest prose writer in English is at this time. And he said, no. He says, well, it's your own guardian. And it's quite true. And it's quite amazing. Just speaking as a professor of literature, I can tell you that I had one person who became a Baha'i, who was doing graduate work and getting a PhD in English literature, who became a Baha'i just based on reading God Passes By, saying, I would believe anything this person says. That's how impressed this woman was with the writings of Shoghi Effendi. Now we get to the things that he did in the way of translation. The Dawnbreakers, my goodness, this compendium is just incredible. This is the first and so far the only translated volume of the 2-volume work by Nabil, and The Guardian only translated. The editing of it and the footnotes and the introductions are just phenomenal. This he did in 1933. The Hidden Words he translated. And in that, he shows himself to be just an incredible poet, because you can't translate poetry from one language to a distinctly different kind of language. You can write another poem which replicates the ideas and some of the images, but you can't replicate the poetry itself. And so it's an incredible thing he accomplishes. Gleanings, and of course this is particularly valuable because he not only chooses from all of the works of Baha'u'llah passages that he thinks are important, but puts them in a narrative order. So the book has a continuity, it has a framework. Prayers and Meditations of Baha'u'llah, a work which is sadly rarely studied and read, but is really remarkable for, if no other reason, to go to those places where Baha'u'llah, in his prayers and in his meditations, is consulting with the Holy Spirit, with God, about what he's trying to accomplish and what assistance he needs and so on. And it's very much as if you were listening to your parents talk to the best child psychologist in the world about, I'm trying to raise these children, can you give me advice, or I need help, and so on. So he's letting you know, he's letting you hear his prayers to God about you. You know, Epistle to the Son of the Wolf, which we have studied, of course, remarkable work in many respects for a number of reasons. And then we go to totally different. I mean, we've seen, you know, administrative skills, dedication, humility, and so on. But then he is responsible not only for the design of the Shrine of the Bab and the concept of the terraces. He also approved the design of the architecture of the archives building and so on. Here is the superstructure going up over the building Abdu'l-Baha had built that ultimately becomes this. So as you can see, here is the building that Abdu'l-Baha had built. And you see the round windows and so on. And when you go in the little hall, the little hallway that surrounds it here, as some of you may have, it's interesting in your mind to sort of take the superstructure away and see the original building and see, oh, so that's what it looked like. So this is a superstructure in the sense that this is what Sutherland Maxwell, with the help of the Guardian, built that fits right over the top of that building. The far-flung ark, this was Shoghi Effendi's concept. And of course, at the center of it, the House of Justice and so on. And it's the foci are the center of this ark, are the graves of Bahia Khanum and Mara Khanum and Mesamidi. And this is the archives building, which was built during the Guardian's lifetime, designed, interestingly, by the architect Mason Remy. Ornamental landscaping, the gardens. He did not just plan that, here he is meditating. He would go every day and say, okay, now this needs to go here and so on. He designed the gardens, even to the extent of what color flowers should go where and so on. Now, this is from a passage we're going to look at more thoroughly next week about the passing of the Guardian, and it's written by Bahia Khanum. The friends of God are well aware of the achievements of their beloved Guardian. What they do not realize fully is that by doing so many things personally over a period of so many years, he and he alone made it possible for the big victories to take place. The fact that he did every single thing himself saved the cause tremendous sums of money. With what he thus saved, he was able to go on and commence a new enterprise. For 36 years, he held in his hands, with power of decision vested solely in him, the funds of the faith the funds of the faith at its world center. No expenditures were authorized, no bills were paid that had not been submitted to him first. First is not there, but that's what it intends. From the beginning of his ministry until about 1940, he saw in person the engineers, the architects, the lawyers who were carrying out his instructions, as well as many high government officials. It was he who negotiated with them, supervised their work, kept down expenses with an ingenuity and insight truly inspired by God. It was he who instructed where every step should be built, the height of every wall, the span between every planted tree, the diameter of every flower bed, even the colors of the flowers. And of course, this is what we have today as a result of his design. And in fact, Leroy always says, in one sense, that one reason he thinks that Shoghi Effendi did not foresee that he was dying is because over here, where this raised terrace of gardens is where the buildings that once were adjacent to Bachi, that were part of the whole mansion, the whole panoply of buildings, were where the covenant breakers lived, and he had them destroyed. And it was one of his great desires, once they got a hold of this property when Mirza Muhammad Ali died in 1939, it was to see with his own instructions these buildings destroyed and obliterated. Well, that's enough. Well, it's not enough. It's never enough. But that's all we will do tonight. Next week, we will go into the incredible events in the transition from the sudden and unexpected death of Shoghi Effendi in England to the election of the House of Justice. And of course, that's only a 6-year period we're talking about, but a lot happens and a lot you need to be aware of. And most especially, we're going to go into some detail about how he died. Why was he in England when he died? Why is he buried in England? There's a lot of detail we'll say about that. And so what happened to the administration of the faith when unexpectedly he passes? And in one case, there's such mysteries involved with all of it, but one of it has to do with a single word that he used in his designation of the hands of the cause. So we'll get to that next time.